Hello and welcome to the second in our bite-sized video series on digital reform. Today we're going to look at the DSA requirement to establish a compliance function, and to help shed a little bit of light on this obligation I'm joined by my colleague Shay, Buckley, Associate in the Technology and Innovation Group.
Thanks, Aoife.
So we're talking today about the DSA and the requirement in Article 41 to establish a compliance function that's independent from the operational functions of the business. Before we get to the detail on what this is likely to entail, I think a quick who and when might be helpful. So I can take the who, and it's one for the very large online platforms and the very large online search engines, many of whom will have gotten their designation from the European Commission on the 25th of April 2023. Do you want to take the when, Shay?
The general application date for the DSA is the 17th of February 2024. However, for the VLOPs and the VLOCs, which we're discussing today, it's 4 months from when they receive their designation. So as you mentioned, those who received their designation in April of this year, their obligations will begin to kick in August 2023. So we expect to see the compliance functions being set up over the summer in order to meet that deadline.
Okay, so it's VLOPs, VLOs, and it's from August of this year. Can you tell us a little bit about what the compliance function is expected to do once it's set up?
Article 41.3 of the DSA sets out the minimum statutory tasks that the compliance function must carry out. These include cooperating with the Irish Digital Services Coordinator and the European Commission under the DSA, ensuring that the risks identified in Article 34 of the DSA are identified, properly reported on, and that there are mitigating measures in place, informing and advising management in relation to relevant obligations under the DSA, and monitoring compliance with codes of conduct or crisis protocols under the DSA. So it's clear that there's a broad range of responsibility here, from regulatory liaison to risk assessor to even potential mentor to some of the management.
A broad range of functions there indeed. So I'm conscious that for many VLOPs and VLOs, they'll be at this stage now ahead of that August deadline where they're in the process of setting up their compliance function. I'm interested to hear a little bit more from you, Shay, about the independence requirement for the compliance function.
Yeah, so the DSA states that the compliance function must be independent of the operational functions of the business. And this will obviously ring bells for anyone who's familiar with the GDPR and the role of the data protection officer, and the need for that role to be independent in the performance of its functions. However, the DSA requirement is slightly different in that it requires the entire compliance function to be independent, as opposed to the GDPR, which just designates one specific role. On top of this, the DSA also states that the head of the compliance function must be a senior manager with distinct responsibility for the compliance function. So it seems that the DSA envisages a bigger operation than is envisaged under the GDPR with the DPO.
Thanks, Shay. I suppose when you mention independence and that GDPR parallel there are two other things that kind of strike me about the compliance function under the DSA. I suppose the first is the requirement for staff to have qualifications. The DSA requires that they have professional qualifications, knowledge, experience, and the ability to fulfill the tasks that you outlined earlier, which I suppose is similar to the professional qualities and data protection expertise that's required for a DPO under the GDPR. The second piece, which you've kind of alluded to there, is the head of the compliance function, and that they will need to have a direct reporting line to management, which again is similar to the DPO needing to report to the highest level of management of a controller. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the head of the compliance function will need to link in with management?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, one of the tasks in Article 41.3 for the compliance function is to advise and inform management of relevant obligations under the DSA. And as you mentioned, the head of compliance will be reporting directly to management, and the head of the compliance function is empowered by the DSA to raise concerns and warn where non-compliance with the DSA or where the risks identified in Article 34 affect or may affect the VLOP or the VLOC.
Okay, so I think probably for a lot of organizations, this is where the rubber is going to hit the road in terms of the head of the compliance function and where that reporting line with management should begin and where it should end. Looking at the legislation, I think probably the clearest hint that we can get on what are priority tasks for the compliance function are kind of, as you've alluded to there, the reference to systemic risks that are set out in Article 34, and maybe also the general task you mentioned earlier about monitoring compliance with obligations under the DSA. I suppose of the tasks given to the compliance function, are these really what might be considered priority areas for it?
Yes, definitely. They seem like priority areas for the compliance function. So we look at Article 34 and the systemic risks that are identified there. These involve things like the actual or foreseeable negative effects for the exercise of fundamental rights, and the actual or foreseeable negative effects in relation to gender-based violence, the protection of public health and minors, and serious negative consequences for a person's physical or mental well-being. These do read as priority issues under the DSA, and so will be priority issues for the compliance function, and in particular the head of the compliance function when they're linking in with management.
Okay, so a very full to-do list for the head of the compliance function and the function itself once established from August of this year. Thanks very much for that, Shay. That's all we have time for today, but stay tuned for further videos in our digital reform series, which will be posted on the Arthur Cox website. Thanks very much for watching.